Okay, so my talk is titled A Meditation on Governance and Culture. I'm Evan Van Ness. I have a newsletter called Week in Ethereum. If you aren't subscribed, you can do that now. There's my shilling. So this is a meditation, so if you will, if you would humor me, close your eyes. I really never close my eyes when speakers ask me to close my eyes, but I don't know. You can if you want. I would appreciate it. So imagine you are an American colonialist in 1776 deciding whether to revolt or not, whether to sign the Declaration of Independence. So you are a white male, which in the blockchain space, of course, probabilistically is relatively possible. You are an aristocrat, you live a comfortable life, you're well off, you're respected in your community. You have wild ideas of self-sovereignty for your day, which is you believe they are intrinsic in the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness comes from God, as the Declaration of Independence says. Actually, it was originally pursuit of property, and then they changed it to pursuit of happiness because they considered property to be a subset of happiness. By the way, there's a point to the fact that I'm doing American history. I'm trying to make a larger point. The U.S., basically, the colonies started for reasons of a lot of them moved for freedom, for tax reasons. There were tax breaks given to move there. So you are there, you have a relatively low effective tax rate, 2 to 10%, depending on your colony. And so before you open your eyes, if you have your eyes closed, which most of you don't, because we're blockchain people, we don't do anything like people ask us. Would you risk your life against the greatest fighting force of all time, the redcoats, the British governments, knowing that you are likely to be hanged, possibly your family, you'll lose your wealth, your family will lose their wealth, and if in a couple generations, 5, 6, 8, whatever we are generations, the effective tax rate would be 33%. I'm not actually making any sort of anti-tax whatever. You can open your eyes if you have them closed. Point here, aside to say that long-term governance is hard and whatever you want is not necessarily what will happen in the future. So maybe you would actually sign that document. Maybe you would sign the Declaration of Independence and revolt at great personal risk. America is doing okay. But my larger point here is that governance and culture matter, and in the long run, what you want is probably not what will actually happen. But by the way, so the colonists in the colonies, that was 2 to 10%. In Britain at the time, they were more 15 to 20%. So they were already paying way less taxes than they would if they had been in Britain. Kind of random point. So there's some parallels to our space, which obviously you probably picked up since I said self-sovereignty, which is, they were aristocrats. I'm not calling us aristocrats by any means, but we are privileged enough to, either live in a well-off nation or be able to travel to Germany and to know about bleeding-edge tech. They had wild ideas of self-sovereignty, and that sounds like us in Ethereum and decentralization. The U.S. started for tax reasons and freedom of religion. I think that's relatively fair to say about a lot of the early blockchain people as well. It's sort of a libertarian, and it's not always political, but non-mainstream idealists, people that are have ideas outside of the mainstream. So the early American governance after they won the revolution from England, they were very distrustful of centralization. They had a bunch of the colonies became states, and they were very, very loosely confederated under the Articles of Confederation. George Washington was, I mean, this is like somewhat of a semantic argument, but he was not really the first president. There were people that held the title, the President of the United States Congress Assembled, I think it exactly was, and there were like 8 people that held that title, like before George Washington. George Washington was the first president once they ratified the Constitution, which, while they were believers in democracy, they wanted people to be able to vote. They were very skeptical of direct democracy as well. They built a lot of checks into that system. And when they ultimately did decide that they wanted some centralized government, they wanted to keep it very, very small and only limited to certain things. So they wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to check centralized power. I'll come back to that a little bit more later. And by the way, don't get too hung up on the American thing. People like to nitpick history, which you can always make arguments about. I'm just trying to draw broad strokes for our space. In our space, on-chain voting is basically the equivalent of direct democracy, and I think a lot of people are pretty skeptical about on-chain voting these days. First of all, the plutocracy, a lot of tokens in individual projects are not very distributed to start with, so we can't really be sure of is it a particularly decentralized vote. The incentives are often not there to vote, and you can try to build those in or whatever, but it's also hard. For instance, LivePeer has an interesting thing where you bond your tokens to transcoders, but and I'm not going to get too deep into their structure, but it is, having recently done it, it was hard to actually decide between transcoders who I was going to delegate to. And it took some work, right? Which I'm still not even sure that I was completely technically qualified for. Because DevOps is hard. Another problem is that the result is known on-chain, right? So until we get better privacy, basically everyone will know who you vote, what you voted for. And obviously that has problems because of, there's Vitalik wrote a post years ago about, I forget what he called, I think epsilon attacks. So it makes it easy to bribe, to do bribes, because if you know what votes are, then you can promise in a contract, people that vote for this will get this. And then Phil Diane had an article, which I'm probably might be butchering, but about trusted execution environments, and in the future, even making some of the privacy features irrelevant, because you could incentivize people to run software in trusted environments, and then it would be trustless for bribes. Of course, you would still have to sort of trust that software and have these trusted enclaves, but the future of on-chain voting, I don't think it's dead, but I think it's complicated at the very least. So shift gears a little bit to talk about Dapp governance. Right now we are basically at this, the point of Dapp governance is to get your thing live, so it's not usually particularly decentralized, right? It's the founders who want to get it live so that they get rid of the risk of the SEC coming after them. And then you sort of work on further decentralization of your government from there. And of course, upgrading your features and to your roadmap requires centralization, right? I don't think there's really much argument about that. So some ideas. about that. Like the solution space is large, right? So there are good experiments to run. You know, you've seen Maker. Their basically philosophy is to take it slow and experiment. And they've been doing this, you know, since the start years ago. Dan Finley has a proposal he calls strange loop, which is essentially delegating to people that you trust and letting them vote for you, essentially, which I think is a really interesting proposal and maybe solves some of the capability arguments around on-chain voting, because if I don't feel confident that I can evaluate the choices in a vote, I could delegate my vote to my friend who I know does know a lot about that subject. And then Aragon, even in the last couple days, well, they've released a survey Dapp, but they're also thinking about, you know, having signaling votes that are non-binding, also binding votes, having veto power between token holders and founders, quorums, majorities, supermajorities. I think all of those make, you know, some of those make on-chain voting a little bit more palatable, but I mean, I think the core idea, which is checks and balances, culture matters. I think it's like the only thing that really matters in like the midterm is what your culture is. So, and I think for Dapps that particularly means being clear about your values, repeating them ad nauseum. That's unfortunately a big part of what leadership is about. Cite them when making difficult decisions. I mean, that's really what they're there for, right? Like if you have a difficult decision and you don't default to what your values are as an open source project or even as a centralized company, like why do you even have them, right? Like you shouldn't have wasted all those meetings and HR and whatnot if like your values don't guide your difficult decisions. In Dapps, I think it also means that you need to build communication tools and think carefully about how you communicate to your community. And like I said, I think culture is really like the thing that, you know, in the short term, it's probably going to be founders, but in the midterm, it's like what your culture is. So long term, though, is like more of a dichotomy, right? Which is, you know, there's like sort of two sides to this, which is the Nick Szabo view, which is humans are wet code, and anywhere that they are involved is like a security risk, right? A security hole. And then there's like the flip side, which is software which isn't being updated, which, you know, kind of needs humans until we figure this whole AI thing out. Software that isn't being updated is dead. So, I mean, I think they're both right. So long-term attacks, and I'm just going to like talk about some of the things that have happened in America, not because I think they're good or bad, just because I think they are somewhat incisive. You know, the states were originally supposed to be like these sovereign entities, and the federal government was supposed to serve the states, and that's like clearly not what actually happened, right? The federal government in America is way larger than the states. In fact, even the original idea of the founders was basically to have the states have the Senate represent the states, and the House would represent the people. And even, you know, there was a constitutional amendment that changed that to give Senate elections to the voters instead of to state legislatures. There's a famous quote as well from, I think, the Federalist Papers saying that the Supreme Court was the least dangerous branch of government. But now it's like, in America, it's like 9 elites that are all educated at Harvard or Yale Law School basically decide every contentious issue. I find that to be interesting. And the legislative branch was arguably supposed to be the most powerful for most of the founders. And then they were wrong, really, because probably it's the least powerful today. Congress in America often passes legislation that basically just authorizes the executive branch to write all the regulations. to enforce that legislation. And so it's basically they tell the executive branch to they kick the can to make difficult decisions to unelected regulators. Anyway, there's many more. My point here is not to get hung up on any of those. I know that's some of this is mildly political. It's just to say that governance is really hard. So thinking about that and thinking about our space, the solution space to invent checks and balances is large, and that's kind of the whole point of why we're here for a lot of us. Futarchy is a really cool idea. So hooray for prediction markets, because it's basically you make conditional bets on future states, and then you will make money or not if the conditions happen. So it's a way to vote with your money, you put your money where your mouth is, basically. I think there's some really cool things that are being done on that. I know Gnosis is sort of planning to do that at some point in the future. I think that's great. I think another solution is making it easy to fork, and so I call that Forkyness. So some ideas for Forkyness. I think it means different things for different projects, and I think obviously we are still this is nascent technology, so this is long term, but as in most things, you should begin with the end in mind. So I would say it's self-determination for communities, right? You want to make it so that your community can grow, and the difference between a nation state and an open source project is that you can fork, right? If a part of your community wants to go off and do something else or has different values, they can do that. And so I'd say ETC was a good thing. You basically make it possible for people to use your community. So I wanted to give a couple examples of Forkyness. I definitely, it's an idea I had a couple weeks ago. I gave an early version of this talk on July the 10th. And then on July the 13th, Simon, who is an idea machine, of course, I've joked about making a section in my newsletter, Simon's ideas and the derivatives of them that other people come up with, which is amazing. I mean, he's been so influential in our space. His idea was basically that you would incentivize forking tokens by or early adoption of forks to overcome some issues around coordination issues by either having people burn, so you burn to get more, you burn your old tokens to have the new fork token, or you have a bonded curve where basically the early adopters would get more than the late adopters of this fork. I also think Forkyness for Augur and Gnosis in the future could build out their token to be used as a general purpose oracle more than they even have. That's a very long-term thing, obviously. It's an idea that came to mind. So that is my talk. If you have nitpicky questions on American history, I don't know, it's probably not the best time right now. You can badger me with those afterwards, but